attaches basically to what's called your medial epicondyle or your funny bone, and then it runs basically right down your elbow and attaches to your ulna. Kind of difficult to understand. Its length is about 2 inches, but something people can quickly grasp is the concept of a large paper clip. Take a large paper clip, we've all used them all the time. Basically, a large paper clip is a pretty good representation of how big your UCL is. That's all you're dealing with. And that UCL runs, again, basically from your funny bone to the bottom tip of your, just above, sort of to the proximal tip of what's called your ulna. I said if we were going to try and understand why UCLs tear, we can kind of answer that in one word, torque. Well, let's start to quantify what happens there. So in this study by ASMI, they looked at college pitchers, 21 college pitchers, and they wanted to understand, they wanted to quantify how much torque was being placed on the elbow. And they had a group of pitchers, and basically all of those pitchers, they threw average 80 miles per hour. And what they found was that on a fastball, the average amount of torque being placed on the elbow at 82 miles per hour of torque, or at 80 miles per hour, was 82 Newton meters of torque. And you can read each one and get a sense. So obviously the fastball is the single highest rated pitch in terms of torque being placed on the elbow. So 82 Newton meters, that's kind of a difficult concept for a lot of people to understand. It certainly was for me. Guys who are coaches who teach physics probably can quickly grasp that. So I wanted to understand in my own mind, so explain to me what torque means. And some of you are probably wondering why I'm holding this drill. So I went to our local Home Depot, got a drill, which actually measures pounds of torque on a drill at 500 Newton meters, or at 500 inch-pounds, which translates into 56 Newton meters of torque. So all of you have a drill at your house, turn on a drill. Every time you turn on a drill, the instant you turn that drill on, and this is a pretty small drill, this is generating 56 Newton meters of torque. Take an 80 mile per hour fastball, and you're generating 82 Newton meters of torque on your elbow each time you do this. So this drill being turned on is probably 40% less than the amount of torque your elbow has to withstand every single time somebody throws an 82 mile per hour pitch. Then you start to understand what your elbow has to handle. So, UCL tears, you want to understand them, it really becomes a math problem. You throw an 80 mile per hour pitch, you end up with about 80 Newton meters of torque being placed on your elbow joint. The UCL itself, through testing in numerous labs, can roughly accommodate about 35%, or about 35 Newton meters of that torque. Now, that's been tested time and again. Some people may argue it's not 35, maybe it's 40, maybe it's 42, and it might vary depending upon who you're testing. And these have been tested again and again and again. When we were at Dr. Andrews' lab, ASMI, we spent several hours in their cadaver lab, and we watched this guy actually do testing on UCLs to get a sense as to when they tear. Kind of a bizarre experience, kind of like the whole high school biology, dissect the frog, smell the formaldehyde kind of thing. But you get a sense for what's happening. So you only get 35 Newton meters of torque, and the UCL just tears. So that was one of the first revelations for us, is that the UCL alone can handle the torque being placed upon it. So then you go, what's next? Well, you get into layback, maximum external rotation. You end up with a UCL that can handle some torque. The next structure that can handle torque is actually the bones that sit between your radius and your humerus. So think about it. You go to throw. If you look at the red arrow, the UCL wants to stretch. The bones want to compact. Between those two, you get about 35 Newton meters of torque on the UCL stretching. You get about another 21 Newton meters of torque in a healthy UCL when these bones want to compact. You can get more out of the bones if the UCL is torn, because the UCL can't withstand the stress that's being placed on your UCL or the joint when you actually throw a fastball. But remember, so this gets us, quickly do the math, we get to 40, what's that? We get to 56, but we got to get to 80. So all you're left with is muscle. So what muscles end up helping? That's where we started. The UCL will do its best. UCL tries to get thicker over time, just over a chronic lifetime of throwing. You look at little kids, 12 to 14 years old, you measure UCL thickness in their throwing arm versus their non-throwing arm, the UCL starts to get thicker by 8%. By the time people get to be 17, 34 years old, that UCL starts increasing in thickness dramatically. You get to the point where injury, it gets thicker to the point that it can't do anything anymore because that's all scar tissue. So what happens? You have too much torque on the UCL, something's got to give. You end up with a blowout. Either a blowout because it pops, or you get sort of this slow deflation, which some people don't feel a pop, and that's what's happening. You're having this slow degradation, and the UCL can't withstand torque anymore. So, you want to prevent a UCL tear? You have two variables you can manipulate. You can decrease the load that's being placed on the elbow joint when you throw, or you can increase the torque limit that the overall joint can withstand. Guys who focus on mechanics are really focused on figuring out how to decrease load. There's no question that there have been studies which suggest that there are some mechanical fixes that guys who understand mechanical efficiency and the concept of a kinetic chain can reduce load. A few things that research has shown clearly. You throw sidearm, you're increasing the amount of torque you're placing on your elbow. The more you get extension this way from coming out of external rotation here, the greater the valgus load being placed on your elbow. The tighter you can get into flexion, the less valgus load. If you rotate your trunk before foot strike, guys who throw and the trunk starts to fly open early, valgus torque will increase. And the last one is, it kind of catch-22, but if you get more external rotation when you throw, you will increase the amount of torque being placed on your UCL. Makes sense. So the problem is, you want to throw harder, you also need to increase the amount of external rotation in most instances. So it's kind of a catch-22. So one thing that we also know for guys, certainly for coaches, trainers, if you improve balance, you enable people to stabilize on their front side better, you can reduce torque. All of those are mechanical fixes, and certainly we would encourage any coach, player, trainer to do all he can mechanically to figure out how to reduce load. But regardless how much load we reduce, it's important to recognize that the UCL alone can't handle the torque that's required. So, guys have focused on shoulder health for years. We had this conversation when we were at ASMI. You go to any field anywhere in America and you'll see shoulder bands, and guys have done a great job improve the overall health of the shoulder. Fantastic, we tell everyone to do it, but we need to understand, improving shoulder health does nothing for your elbow. Major League Baseball has found this out. If you look at what's happened there, they've done such a great job rehabbing and strengthening shoulders that all we've done now is we've pushed torque from a shoulder down to an elbow, which is why you see shoulder injuries have dramatically decreased at the major league level, and we've just seen a corresponding increase in elbow-related injuries. Now, we come in and we say, okay, is there a way to actually increase the overall capacity of the joint, the elbow joint, to withstand greater torque? And for that, that's really been the focus of our research for the better part of a year. We start with the same math equation. We say we know we have a limit on what the UCL can do because there's no exercise you can do to strengthen a UCL. It just is what it is. It's like any ligament, that's its strength. You only can get so much compressing force from a bone. There's nothing we can do to increase that. So we're really left with muscles. So then the question becomes obvious. Which muscles and how do you train them? The reason that becomes so important is we've got to understand this concept of fatigue. So if you have muscles which overlay your UCL, which can provide some resistance, if those become fatigued, then you increase the stress on the UCL. You increase the stress on the UCL, you're going to start tearing it more frequently, then you just kind of create this vicious cycle. So we start to look at the concept of fatigue and say, is there a way to manage that by increasing strength of the muscles that can offload some of that torque? we need to understand if that's what we're going to focus on, we need to understand, again, which side of which muscles do we need to focus on and which protection can they give us. So if you look at the UCL,